Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to talk about cohabitation, but not cohabitation in the way you're probably thinking of. Most people probably think two people deciding to move in together as a step in the progression of a relationship, but we're going to talk about it from the context of something completely different, and that is moving in with family. And we thought this would be a really good topic because more and more often, due to the economic climate of our country and probably the world, more and more families are being forced to cohabitate and to move in together with siblings or parents and that kind of thing just to make it. So both Mark and I have done this before, and I'm about to do it again with my father-in-law. So in Mark's experience, it worked really well. And in my most recent experience, it was a complete disaster. And we're going to do it again, but I feel a lot more optimistic about it this time. So we're just going to talk about some ways to make it go smoother, some ways to help make it an easier process for everyone. So let's start by talking about our own experiences. Mark, why don't you talk about your experience living with your children?
So I actually have one experience with my daughter and her family. So daughter, husband, two kids, and they lived with us for a year. And I would say I'm having an experience right now with one daughter who lives with us essentially part-time. And then next year, it's pretty certain my son and his fiance are coming back from the Netherlands, and they want to live in Salt Lake. And so they will live with us for a time when they are looking for a home. That would be the goal. But I think it's easier, when they're here. So the first time it happened, which was several years ago, my daughter, her husband, and two boys moved from San Francisco, and their goal, it was short term, although it was over a year, but we knew it was going to be that long. And the goal was for them to find a house. Right. And so they did. Unfortunately, they found a house before it totally went crazy here in Salt Lake City housing. Yeah. And so we did set out, and actually they initiated it. This is Adrienne, who you've heard on this podcast before. Yeah. And so she's a psychologist and pretty self-aware. And so she was actually the one who led this effort to say, let's sit down and talk about the expectations and set up some sort of structure. And so we did that way before they came because they knew it was going to happen when my grandson started kindergarten. That was kind of what prompted the move to Salt Lake City. And so, we knew beforehand this was coming up. So we had many discussions actually about before it ever happened. Now, I think the thing that made it work, and it was actually wonderful. I look back on that time and I loved being certainly with my daughter and her husband, Jake. I loved being with the grandkids. To have the grandkids here, wake up every morning. We wouldn't put them to bed unless we were taking care of them for their parents were somewhere. But I'd typically be the one to see them early in the morning because I get up early and they got up early. It was wonderful. But it worked because, and I have to acknowledge that we have a house that works pretty well because they had the basement, 3 bedrooms down there for them, 2 bathrooms down there. So it was convenient. Right. And at night, they really had their own space because there really wouldn't be any reason for us usually to go downstairs, and we had the upstairs. So we had separate spaces. We had a set of expectations. And there was always good communication if anything wasn't working. But as I thought back on that year, I don't recall there ever being any difficulties between us at all. And I think we're all pretty easygoing. So that worked well. But currently, my daughter, I don't think you've actually heard Sierra on here as well. Yes. Who's a pediatrician. And she and her husband divorced about a year ago. And they did what is called nesting, as far as they're doing it now with the custody of the kids, meaning the kids stay in the home and the parents are the ones who move in and out. And so she lives with us during the halftime when the kids are with their father. That's going to end in probably another month because my ex-son-in-law has purchased a home. So that is going to change. But it's been working. So we've had her here, easily for a year, halftime. And again, she's downstairs in that same space that Adrian occupied. And it's just really easy. And I think it's because the expectations are pretty clear. So, we'll talk more about what kind of expectations do you set out. But I think there can be positive experiences if you plan for it. And I've actually worked with couples, usually couples who come in and say, we're having this difficulty with our adult child who is living with us. And almost universally, the reason it doesn't work is nobody talked about it before.
Yes.
And honestly, I don't get that, because if you're going to have it's a really I don't know if I'd call it a disruption. It's a change, certainly in the status quo. I don't understand why you wouldn't talk about it before, but a lot of people don't. And I don't understand the reason why. Anyway, that's going to be critical to talk about the expectations. So I've had positive experiences.
So, and I have actually technically done this twice. And the first time was right after Curtis and I got married. So around that time, my dad had just gotten a local contract. He's a truck driver, and he would be home every night. But at the time, my parents were living about an hour and a half south of where my dad was based out of. And so it just the commute absolutely did not make sense. And so he rented an apartment and he stayed there during the week. And then he went home on the weekends, and Curtis and I lived there full time. And ultimately that worked pretty well. I mean, I've got to say it was just a little bit awkward sharing a 2-bedroom apartment as a newlywed with my dad.
Yeah, but that would be awkward.
But ultimately, I think it was an okay experience. I mean, we were certainly glad to finally be in our own space, as a newlywed couple. So right around the time the pandemic hit, Curtis and I made the decision to move from Utah to Indiana. And we wanted to do a new build, but the problem is we couldn't start the process until we were living in the state. So we had to sell our home in Utah and then basically have residency in Indiana before we could start the process. And so we told my mother-in-law and stepfather-in-law, okay, is it okay if we live with you for, 6 to 9 months while we build a house? And they said, yeah, sure. They were on board with it and everyone was okay. And we did talk about expectations beforehand, but there was a few, I would say, unique circumstances that made it a really rocky process. And I don't want to go into too many details about that, but there was some unmet expectations, I guess you would call it. And it happened on both sides. And a couple of the things that I am comfortable talking about.
Can I just ask, were the expectations talked about before, or were they expectations that no one really verbalized?
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that situations change or expectations change after we had moved in and circumstances were different. And that definitely created some friction. And there was a few different expectations, I think, that changed. And so one of the things that happened was I agreed when we moved in that I would do a lot of the cooking and cleaning, particularly since it's not a very large house. And we had our own space in the basement as well, but we had a shared kitchen space. And that was kind of part of the expectation. And what happened is at the time we moved in, my son was 11 months old. And it was shortly thereafter that he started to crawl. And we kind of talked about baby proofing, and we really disagreed on how that was going to work. And so we had this really big clash ultimately over unmet expectations. I guess we didn't talk beforehand about baby proofing. And so I wasn't comfortable with what she expected, but she was very, very frustrated that I wasn't living up to my end of the deal towards the end. I mean, I definitely wasn't doing as much of the cooking and cleaning as I said I would. So, I mean, and my point is that there's two sides to every story, right? I mean,
yeah, there always is.
Yeah. And so I don't want to make it sound like, it was all her fault, because there was certainly things that I could have done differently. There was things that she could have done differently, but it was really hard. And for many months, it really tanked our relationship. And that was really hard.
I like to ask questions. This is kind of what I do in my office.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But I'm curious what the relationship was like before. Was it one where you could really sit down and have a good discussion where you would listen to each other?
I want to say yes, but I mean, we never really had a need to have any sort of really
Conflict.
important.
So you didn't have any conflict before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and,
Okay.
there wasn't really any conflict. I mean, because we didn't see each other very often. And so when we did see each other, it was like, oh, yes, we soaked up every minute. And it was really, really happy whenever we were around each other. And there'd never been conflict. And so when conflict did arise, neither one of us handled it very well. And
See, that's a good thing to remember for our listeners is that
yeah,
it could be there could be situations where you bring these families, these parts of family together where they've never had the conflict.
yeah,
They've never had to
mhm,
go through that process. And so I think one of the things to be aware of if you're contemplating doing this is you have to talk about, well, how do we handle conflict or address it, even though you haven't had it,
right.
conflict.
Yeah. And we've since been able to repair, and our relationship is really good again. And we both feel really good about where we are now. But for a while, to be honest, neither one of us really liked each other. And
Mhm.
poor Curtis was definitely stuck in the middle of all this.
Stuck in the middle. Yeah, that is a hard place to be.
Oh, it really is. And he did the right thing in siding with me.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yes, he always sided with me and he did the right thing there, but it was still really hard for a while. And a lot of it comes down to is we had very poor conflict resolution. And there
Yeah.
was times where the conflict would get so big that we were all forced to confront it at once. And even that didn't go very well. And I think, like you said, it's really good to have a plan in place to handle conflict before it arises.
So is that kind of the big lesson that you learned in that process is to deal with, even though if you haven't had conflict, try and figure out what does that look like if we do?
Yeah, I would say so. And we're about to do it again. So
Okay.
Curtis's dad lives in Florida, and in the last year, he lost his wife to COVID, Curtis's stepmom, and then he lost his job, and he's gotten really, really depressed. He's also had, at the same time, he had a lot of health issues going on, and so he's having a really hard time finding work that he can do. And so Curtis and I said, well, come move in with us for, we're thinking about a year is the expectation that we've kind of set is, and we feel more confident that it's going to go better. And there's a few reasons for that and that I think it's going to go better. And one is he's very, very easygoing. He stayed with us a few times and he's just a really go with the flow kind of guy. Anything's good with him. And the other thing is we've talked about let's just be open and upfront about things that are upsetting us. And I think that's really important to establish early on is if something isn't working, let's sit down and talk about it rather than just holding it in and letting it fester.
Right. And the context is different though this time, right? Because
Yes.
your house,
Yes.
someone's coming into your house as opposed to
Yes.
you going into someone else's house. So I think that certainly, I don't know if you feel this, I think it gives you a more element of control over what's going to happen. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think so. And thinking back to when we lived with my mother-in-law, I think part of the problem is I think a lot of it was we all just got tired of living together,
Mhm.
because they've lived on their own as empty nesters for so many years. And all of a sudden they've got 3 kids running around their house. And that
Yeah.
can add a lot of stress and a lot of strain. Whereas I think Curtis's dad, Bill is his name, I think he kind of knows what he's getting into. And
Mhm.
I think he's also excited to have someone to kind of help take care of again because
Yeah.
his wife was really, really sick in the end, and he took care of her. I mean, he basically waited on her hand and foot because she needed it, and he did it because he loved her and he's devoted and he wanted to. And that's been a really hard void for him to fill. That's been really hard for him to have no one else to take care of. And so I think he's genuinely looking forward to, having grandkids to dote on and to help take care of. He stayed with us for a few days a couple of months ago and just ravished in helping out with the kids, getting them breakfast in the morning and helping get them to bed. He really loved all that. So I think this is going to be really good for his emotional state.
It sounds like it. As a grandfather myself, I can see how that would be really a great thing to.
Yeah.
And, when you think about different generations living together,
yeah,
that is one of the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about how in at least the American culture, in the past, this hasn't been done very often. And there, in a lot of ways, there are negative attitudes about it. That, okay, adult kids should be on their own. They shouldn't off be, not be living with their parents. But when you think about it, there are many cultures throughout the world where this is the norm.
Yeah.
And it's, I'd say in some cultures, it's the expectation. And what we don't realize is that there are so many benefits, I think, from having multiple generations live under the same roof. Now, there are a lot of challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And, in a lot of cultures, it's that cultural expectation. But I think it's wonderful for grandchildren to be with their grandparents.
Yes.
I think it's also wonderful for parents to have some respite it allows you a little bit more freedom to go out or go on a walk or do something because you have this other adult who loves these kids and is going to take care of them. Mm-hmm. I really think it's a wonderful thing to do.
And that is one of the things that Curtis and I are really looking forward to, is being able to get away. Since our oldest was born, we've never been able to get away just the two of us. Because I don't know, I mean, when your kids are really young, it's hard for anyone but mom and dad to put them to bed.
Oh, yeah.
And we've never lived close enough to family that they could be comfortable enough with our routine and with our kids that they could do that. And so, because it's a big deal for someone else to put your kids to bed, right? I mean,
oh yeah, sure.
And so that is one of the things that we're looking forward to. This year, we're going to celebrate our 11th anniversary. And my goal is that we can finally get away, just the two of us, overnight for our anniversary. And,
that's a great goal.
Yeah, it is. I also think that it's good to talk about those kinds of things like, are you okay with if we do this? And ask those kinds of questions early on. And, I think it's fair to ask those kinds of things of, a parent, because it's something that they would be willing to do, is to keep your kids overnight, because that's kind of a big deal. But it's important to talk about those things.
But I think you do need to talk about it. You need to be creative and think of what are the situations that might arise that we need to talk about. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's much better to be prepared, even though, you may think of, several situations that might arise, and they may not, but at least you've been prepared. So it's not really time wasted. It's anticipating what problems could arise. And I think it makes the experience better for everyone if you do that. It's about planning, I think. And I see many families go into this without adequate planning, and that's a problem.
Right. Yeah. And it causes conflict. And so we talked about setting boundaries early, and, we said before you move in, you need to. And I want to acknowledge that maybe there's times where there's, I don't know, an emergent cases or something where maybe that's not possible. I'm thinking in terms of, a natural disaster happened and you're forced out of your home, and all of a sudden you're forced to move in with someone because you don't have anywhere to live, right? So those kind of emergent situations. But if it's something that you're considering, I think it's very important to sit down and talk about those boundaries and to talk about expectations. And I think it's also very important to be explicit in what you expect. So one of the things that I think is also very important to talk about is if you're a religious family. That's so important. And thankfully, when we lived with my mother-in-law, she had no issues with Curtis and I openly practicing our religion. And she had no problem with us adhering to our religious practices. And Curtis's dad is the same way, but we also had to set a couple of expectations early on, like we don't want you to drink around the kids. No alcohol around the kids. And we also talked about him dating. If he wants to go on a date, obviously he's not going to bring any of his dates here overnight. That kind of a thing. Those are good things to talk about.
Right. And so maybe we could talk about some of the other expectations that people may not think about.
Yeah.
I think some of the things that might be problematic, noise level, music, TV. Someone likes to have the TV on all the time.
Right.
And, maybe the other person doesn't. So TV use, noise level, even bedtimes, going around the house late at night, does it wake people up? What are the expectations around that? I think you mentioned one with the kids, if there are young kids involved, and, it was specific to baby proofing. And I, anticipate what might happen with the kids. What are the expectations around behavior of the children? And so anticipating that, I think, is really important. Can you think of any others? I'm trying to, noise and food around kitchen use.
Yes, cleaning.
Cleaning. Okay, keeping the space clean.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Or neat. What does that actually mean?
Right.
And so, what you might think of as clean, I might think of, that it's not clean. And so I think you have to be pretty specific about what your expectations are. I think that's because most houses only have one kitchen. So in the vast majority of cases, you're going to share a kitchen. And that can be left really messy, dishes in the sink. That can be a real easy source of conflict.
Yeah. Another thing I think you have to talk about is finances, and you have to nail that down very early on.
Right. So, is there rent? Is there not rent? What are the shared costs? Are there any expectations around that? Yeah, you're right. Finances is really important to talk about.
Early on.
I would say before you moved in.
Yes.
So that they can who's ever moving can make an informed decision about whether they want to do it. So you're right. I think that's really an important aspect.
Yeah. And then we kind of talked about this a little bit. A time limit, I think, is also the time expectation of, okay, what is our goal here? What is the expectation? How long do you need to stay here? Do you want to stay here? And how long are you, the person opening your home to, okay with them staying here? And then the other thing that I think is really important to talk about is having regular check-ins where you come together and you say, hey, how is it going? And this was something when I lived with my mother-in-law, we never did, because we all kind of knew how it was going, and it was pretty much just survive until it was over.
Yeah, but it probably would have been more helpful, I just said, because then you could have maybe started the repair and talked about it. But I agree. I think having regular check-ins, I would say to check in weekly on a weekly basis. How are things going this week? Because what I've seen happen, this thing, whatever it is, starts irritating you. And you don't say anything about it, and you think you can, just let it go. But eventually what happens, you just blow up.
Yep.
Which then is worse for the relationship. And there's a lot more to repair after the relationship. Whereas if every week you're checking in and you might say, well, this thing that you did here, I'm not really comfortable with, or can we talk about it? You aren't going to blow up because it's not really big. Going back to the timeline, I think it's a good idea to talk about timeline. I also think there are many situations where it's indefinite, and there might be a need, depending on what's going on, there might be a need where it has to be more permanent. But to talk about that, to what the expectations are, is this permanent? Is it not? I think that is important. I think that often you can say, like for us with Adrian, it was when you buy a house, then, and other than that, we didn't really have an expectation. We thought it would be about a year for them to do that, but it was all linked on when they bought the house.
Right. So one of the things that I thought of, in terms of when it becomes permanent is I think often in our country, or at least in our culture, it's because of health issues. And I think we should acknowledge that can be a whole other ball game, particularly if a parent has to move in because of the declining health in with the kids. That's going to change everything, especially if it's because of a mental health decline.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother issue. And I mean, in cases of Alzheimer's and dementia, you can set all the expectations you want, but sadly, everything's going to change as they, deteriorate. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that aspect. But I mean, again, that's kind of a whole
That's a whole separate issue, but I think, if you're caring for an aged parent with some sort of dementia, one thing that you have to really think about is how do you get respite from that, because you need a break, and what is the plan? But I think it's not only health issues that might cause that. I think often it's financial issues, catastrophic financial issues that often will make it necessary to move in together. I think one of the things that listeners ought to think about is what makes this difficult often is because you're dealing with two generations. So usually we haven't talked about siblings moving in with siblings, which wouldn't be two different generations. But so you have often parents and then children move in, or the other way around, the parents move in with the children. So there's almost this power differential, right, in parenting. And even, as adults, my children are functioning adults, out on their own, but there's still this slight power differential.
Yeah.
And so when you move in, you have to figure out, how do you address that? I think at least acknowledging it, that it exists, because the children moving in with a parent, they are adults and they want to be adults, and often they have children of their own. So if, me as the parent or the grandparent then starts telling them how to raise their kids or what to do, or taking on that parent role like I would have when they were 15,
right,
that's not going to work.
No.
And well, that happens a lot, where parents, they fall back into that role. And most often the child doesn't want to go back into that role of being the kid. He's an adult. He has his own life. He's got a job. He or she's got a job, a family.
Yeah.
So that can be tricky to navigate.
I agree. And I think when it can be the most tricky is if, say, you're a kid coming home from college over the summer. And I guess that was another time where I technically moved back in with my parents. And I went to BYU, Idaho, and we have the 3-track thing. So you're on for 2 tracks and you're off for 1 track. And so Curtis and I were both out of school from end of July until January. And so we had 5 whole months between semesters. And that was the time where we decided that we were going to go back to Washington to get married. And it was a little tough to move back in with my parents after having all of this freedom. And, again, that really odd sort of power differential. And so I think it's good to talk about it. And I also think it completely changes when you're married. That's also another factor that is really important to think about, because I think it's really easy if, as an adult, you're moving back in with your parents and you kind of know their routine, you know their expectations. But when you're married, there's another person, and
the spouse doesn't know that.
Exactly. And so the spouse has to an extent, has to be respectful. Well, I think to a large extent, has to be respectful of their in-laws if they're going to be staying with them. But at the same time, parents have to let their adult children live their adult lives.
Right. The term I've used before in podcasts is, I think when you get married, you're actually blending 2 little mini cultures, right? Yes. Our families of origin are like 2 mini cultures. And so what happens is you are then immersed in somebody else's culture, essentially, as the spouse who's going into their in-laws' home. And that can be hard because you're not used to doing things in that same way, or the same traditions or the same habits. So again, what stands out is to have a healthy dialogue. But that's something that a lot of families struggle with too.
Yeah.
Is having a healthy dialogue. And so if you really want this type of situation to work well, then you've got to practice on your communication skills and do it before, because otherwise it can be a disaster. It can harm the relationship instead of help the relationship.
Right, which is exactly what it did for a time in the case
Yeah.
of me and my mother-in-law. And, and thankfully we've been able to move past that. But it was still hard because a large part of why we moved here was to be closer to family. And it was really hard to have that strained relationship. And, we've been open and talked about this with Curtis's dad and talked about that. And he's like, see, that's what I don't want. And right then I said, okay, let's just agree to be open about it, and let's just agree to talk about things that aren't working, and just let's give ourselves the freedom to say, hey, this isn't working for us. Let's come up with a plan to change it. And you have the same thing. Have a plan for conflict, because chances are it's going to arise.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say it's probably inevitable that some sort of conflict is going to arrive. Have a plan.
So I mentioned that my son's coming back from the Netherlands with his fiance. Here's the conflict that's going to happen. I can already see it.
Okay.
They have two bunnies. So they have two bunnies, and I don't know how they're going to get the bunnies back from the Netherlands, but I'm really allergic to hay. And these bunnies have a lot of hay.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going to happen, but we've got about a year or more to plan for that. But that's the thing we're going to have to address, really, is what are the expectations around these little bunnies? So,
pets that's another.
Oh, that's another one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you bringing a pet with you? And if so, what are the expectations around the pet? Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one.
Yeah. And brainstorm. Try to think of things that can be a problem. And it's not that you're looking to create a problem. It's better to be prepared.
It's the anticipation. I always say anticipate the problems. And if they don't happen, great. Mm-hmm. And if they do happen, you're a little bit more prepared.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So next week, we're going to do another book topic. So we're going to do the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and it's by Stephen R. Covey. And I first read this book in high school. Okay, let me rephrase that. I read a book his son wrote called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens, but they're very, very similar, and it's a really good book, and I think that it'll create an interesting dialogue. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.